Well, South Africa has called for immediate cessation of violence and restraint in the conflict between Hamas and Israel. The country has also called for peace between Israel and Palestine as a war rages on. Pretoria says all sides must seize the opportunity for peace as opposed to violence. For more now, we are in conversation with the Director General of the Department of International Relations, Mr. Zane Dangor. Sir, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, for many years, South Africa has called, for peace in the Middle East, but it looks like there's no peace in that region. How can this peace be achieved, and what is your position as South Africa?
So I think if you look at the events of the last few days, while the magnitude of the attack and the surprise nature of the attack is all the things that are subject to international discussion and debate, the fact that there is an attack isn't really a surprise. If you look at the level of oppression over the last couple of years, with this year being particularly bad, attacks on civilians, attacks on civilian infrastructure in the occupied territories, there was a sense that some response was going to be possible. Our view is that any form of violence is regrettable. No matter the justification, whenever civilians are killed, it's something that just makes the prospects for
and of course
peace a more distant reality. So our view is that there must be an immediate cessation of hostilities. There must be the convening of talks that will lead to a just and lasting peace. And a just and lasting peace really means that the occupation must end. The final status issues must be dealt with, including the right of return, the status of East Jerusalem. And until you have a just and lasting peace, the prospects of peace and a lasting peace will be a distant wish. You'll always have the prospects for violence when there's repression.
I want to come back to that element that you raised of this being a surprise attack and what that would translate to. But we're obviously reporting on the show today. Of course, we heard about this about 2 hours ago, that the Israeli Security Cabinet officially declaring a state of war. Has South Africa reached out to all the stakeholders or some of the stakeholders in this conflict now that it is highly likely to escalate?
At the moment, we haven't reached out to all of the stakeholders. We've been getting reports from our mission on the ground in Ramallah and also our Sharjah in Tel Aviv. We will be assessing what the situation is over the next couple of days and then seek to engage with the Palestinian authorities, and also other stakeholders within the Palestinian Liberation Organization. As you know, Hamas is part of that. They're the de facto government in the Hamas part of the Palestinian territories. We will also be reaching out to the Israelis and the US and other key stakeholders. It's important that we actually ask the international community not to use this attack as a means to give Israel the green light for unparalleled attacks in Gaza, because Gaza is one of the most densely populated regions in the world. It is a virtual open air territory, has been described by many people who've been there. And any form of escalating the conflict there will see significant loss of civilian life. And that means non-combatants in this case. So we would be making this call. We hope that the Security Council in its hearings today will also be making that call, and that we'd be asking for the international community, particularly the big players in the Security Council, to ask for restraint and not to give the green light for more impunity by Israel, given the nature of the attacks over the last couple of days. That will only make the situation worse.
And I did want to touch on the international community. I mean, those who are opposed to the conflict in Gaza have pointed, of course, to the heart of the conflict being the continued illegal Israeli settlements and the oppression of Palestinians. In terms of the international community, especially in as far as what you are hoping that they will call out for, what more pressure do you think needs to be instilled to those countries, particularly the US and the UK, who are saying that Israel is within its rights to defend itself?
So what we must do is just talk to both the US and the UK about the consistency of international law. And this is something we've been engaging on in the international community over the last few months. that in any situation, including this situation, the annexation of land through the use of force is prohibited by international law. Now, this has been happening in the Palestinian territories unabatedly over the last 70 years and been escalated over the last 2 to 3 years with settler communities taking over more and more Palestinian lands in breach of international law with the tacit permission of the major powers. No real recrimination, no real accountability for their actions. And that level of impunity, according to people like Daniel Levi, who's a former Israeli negotiator, has given rise to almost a hubris kind of thinking by the Israeli government that they can do and get away with anything. The surprise of this attacks and the magnitude of this attack shows that the level of repression has reached a stage where young Israelis are no longer willing to condone the status quo. They are no longer going to be hoping for peace talks that never happen, but just mask the repression to take place unabatedly. So we need a new discussion within the UN. We need the big players to acknowledge that the kind of impunity that they've allowed Israel to get away with can no longer be justified. And if they want a just and lasting peace, the international community must be serious about holding Israel in particular as the occupying power. And as we said, calling it an occupation is not an allegation, it's a statement of fact. They must let the occupying power comply with international law, comply with the agreements on what constitutes the parameters for a lasting and just peace, whether it's a two-state solution along the 1967 borders or something differently, but we need a lasting peace. And the impunity that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 decades, and particularly over the last 2 years, can no longer be allowed to go on. And that's a key message that we hope the Security Council brings across today.
And one obviously will be monitoring that very closely. Now, of course, when we look at, just some of the areas that are currently in conflict right now, including the war in Ukraine, there are concerns, especially when you look at what's been happening now over the past 48 hours in Gaza. There are concerns that the arms proliferation and the arms trade by big countries is another cause for some of these conflicts. Do you agree with that?
I think that what we've been warning for a while is that, the war in Ukraine and the idea that that war will be settled through conventional means is one that we've warned is not going to happen. We've also asked for an immediate cessation of hostilities there, for peace talks to take place with immediate effect. We understand the fact that Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty was breached by Russia. We've called it an unlawful war, but we've also called for all the parties to come on board. But what you're seeing is an escalation of this kind of conflicts in other parts of Europe. We see it in Eastern Europe. We see it in Kosovo, we see it in Africa. I think that there is a sense that the kind of peace and stability that we have seen to some extent over the last 2 decades is under threat, and all the more reason why the Security Council, the Reformed Security Council and the UN must be very clear in how it's going to ensure that international law is applied consistently and in all situations. Because if it's not done so, the institution and its laws and norms are undermined, giving rise to the kinds of conflicts that we see. And also the sense that by many players that they can get away with it because they see the kind of impunity that big players in particular are enjoying.
Mr. Dangor, as we wrap up our conversation, I want to pick on something that you said earlier in terms of just how surprised everybody was taken by this attack on Israel by Hamas. Now, of course, Israeli security forces are facing a number of questions about the multi-pronged attack, which laid bare essentially their intelligence gaps. To what extent are you concerned that we will now see, of course, an attack by Israel that will probably be one of the biggest since, in the past years that we have seen? I mean, the last one, I think, lasted about a month, and that was in the early 2000s. How concerned are you that the retaliation by Israel will actually because of the fact that it was embarrassed by this attack and its intelligence, gaps have also been laid bare?
So I think the concern we must have is, as Daniel Levi pointed out, is that there has been a hubris that has emerged by Israel about that it's almost omnipotent in its ability to enforce its will in the region, and particularly on the Palestinians. And the fact that this has embarrassed them, but also there's been the largest, and it's sad, it's been the largest casualty amongst Israeli soldiers and civilians, and that's creating an internal dynamic. Our fear is that with a tacit go-ahead by the US and the others in their statements, that Israel will feel that they have the go-ahead, a green light to use whatever force necessary to assert their dominance and authority over the occupied Palestinian territories, especially Gaza. And this could lead to large-scale civilian deaths in an environment where you have perhaps one of the most densely populated areas. It's a veritable open-air prison. People can't really move freely. That you will see large-scale casualties among civilians. And that should be prevented. I think we should be asking the US and others to also be restrained in how they engage on this matter and call on Israel to de-escalate.